Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth edition of Talkdeath, Eco Burials and Human Composting with Katrina Spade and Joe Sehee. Hi, Katrina. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Hey.
So sorry, I think we're about 3 minutes late. Sorry, everybody. Thank you all for watching. We're going to start with some quick intros and then get right into your awesome questions. So if you're on Twitter or on YouTube or even on Google+, send us your questions with #TalkDeath, and we have Greg on the other line checking out all the social media to see what's coming through the channels, and we'll hopefully get through all of your questions today. So for the first introduction, I'm Mandy, and I'm the founder of Keeper. Essentially, we are a social memorial website where you can store and share all the photos, videos, and stories of your loved ones for free and interact with the Keeper community. Also, our Keeper mobile app, which is now on iOS and Android, it gives you exact directions to a monument in a cemetery, including green cemeteries, and has a really cool function where you can just take a photo of the monument and the memorial will come up on your phone, so you can discover all the interesting life stories within the cemetery. So go ahead and download it for free and send a good review.
My name is Jeremy. I'm the communications director here at Keeper, and I'm also a PhD student in religion and anthropology. And my focus is on interactions with the dead via new media and digital technologies. And for those of you who are watching your first Talk Death event, this is the chance for you, the general public, to ask members of the death profession and community your questions. We noticed that there was a huge divide between the public and professionals, especially considering that most of you will only encounter a death professional in a funeral setting. So the ultimate goal of Talk Death, then, is to promote death positivity by creating an open and honest discussion about this huge taboo and fear that we have in Western culture.
So today we're very lucky to have two really big names and important players in the green burial movement. We have Katrina Spade, who's currently with us from Seattle. She's the founder and executive director of the Urban Death Project. Katrina has a background in anthropology, architecture, and industrial design. And for those of you who may not know, the Urban Death Project is a compost-based renewal system, which started as a Kickstarter project and quickly surpassed its goal of $90,000. The project is based around a conceptual 3-story structure within which bodies and high-carbon materials are placed. The bodies are composted and turned into rich organic material.
Joe Sehee founded the Green Burial Council as a response to the growing demand for funeral and burial alternatives. There was a need to set standards that could help guide the movement into the future. So for over a decade now, the Green Burial Council has been, quote, working to connect death with life by ensuring that end-of-life rituals and the facilities, products, and practices associated with them further legitimize environmental aims, end quote. Joe and the council have worked hard to make green burial a viable alternative for the public and funeral professionals alike. Yeah. So with that in mind, Katrina, is there anything here that we missed or anything that you would like to add?
Right away? No, you did a great job.
Thanks. Joe, same question to you. Anything that we missed or anything that you would like to add?
Oh, it'll probably come up in the conversation, so that's, I think, fine for now.
All right, perfect.
And Joe's with us from Melbourne, Australia, by the way, everyone, and it is very early for him, so we're very lucky to have him here at the same time as all of us. So let's get right into the questions. Our first one is from Twitter handler Morbid Curiosity Game. Is there anything unexpected or curious about green burials that would surprise people? So a little icebreaker here.
Well, I don't know what's counterintuitive or not these days because I'm so close to things, but I guess one of the things is that green burial really involves participation by families in a way that a conventional funeral does not, and that families are doing everything from, you know, the building of burial containers and opening and closing of graves, sometimes the creation of actual burial grounds as well. So it's a real hands-on approach in a way that we've never quite seen. It can be made turnkey, and it can involve funeral directors and conventional cemeterians to the extent people want to, but it's also got this big DIY component that I don't think a lot of people quite understand.
Katrina, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would say Joe's more of an expert on green burials for sure, but what he just said, those principles are part of what we're trying to bring into the Urban Death Project into our cities. Is that very thing, that very hands-on experience, because even though it can be heart-wrenching, we really think there's a lot of value for the grieving process and just for families going forward in participating deeply.
So I guess the real surprise is how it's really community-based and ritual-based, which most people would not necessarily expect, if you're just thinking of it as a traditional burial in that way. So that's definitely really key, and that's actually going to come up in a question later on.
Yep. So this next question is aimed to Joe, and it's from YouTube user Mark Leclerc. He wants to know, how do you ensure the preservation of green burial spaces? Do green burials remain in perpetuity? Is it possible that developers could buy the land that holds a green burial space?
It's really an excellent question, and it's one of the things, I think one of the biggest contributions that the Green Burial Council has made in setting forth standards is that it upholds these ecological and aesthetic promises. So when a cemetery, particularly a natural burial ground, conservation burial ground, as opposed to what we call a hybrid at the lower level of certification, when a conservation or natural burial ground opens up, what happens there will be enforced by a conservation easement, usually with a land trust doing monitoring and reporting to uphold those standards. And with a natural burial ground, it's at least a deed restriction. So while there's no chance, there would be a chance of the cemetery conveying hands, most likely it will, there's no chance that the operator could rescind and say, you know what, this green burial thing's not going to take off, or we don't think it's going to make sense anymore. So their hands really are tied. Now, conventional cemeteries can't be foreclosed upon. You don't see them turning into car dealerships. This is why conventional lenders never get involved in their financing. But a green burial ground that doesn't have some sort of legally enforceable mechanism that runs with the land can change into something else. And I've been around the world touring facilities where that's in the works. So it's something that consumers need to understand.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Great.
So this one is from Twitter. Julia Porter asks, what can we do at the death positive community to support the efforts of those making green burial an option? What do you need? So Katrina, I think this might be even great for you, especially you do some work with Caitlin Dowdy, if I'm not mistaken, and even Tanya Marsh. Shout out to Tanya, she's awesome. So what do you think that we can do as a community to help this movement?
Well, number one, hashtag death positivity. I think, or is it death positive? I'm not sure, or maybe both. And that's just leading to the fact that every time we have a conversation with a family member, with a friend, with a colleague about this stuff, it's actually moving the whole movement forward, which is really amazing because it's sort of like the easiest thing you can do is just to have a conversation. From the perspective of the Urban Death Project, we are finishing up our proof of concept phase and moving towards, we've designed and now need to build a prototype. So I've got a lot of fundraising needs around the work I'm doing with this project. But in general, having the conversations and sharing the different options that are coming online, that's huge.
And what about you, Joe? Is there anything they think the community can do? Is there anything happening in Australia right now?
Well, what we're doing here, and we're hoping it's going to be part of a global initiative, is to get people to express their interest in the concept to come forward. Because in Australia, in fact, where I live in Victoria, cemetery trusts, only these governmental bodies can own and operate cemeteries. So people really have to step up and say, this is what I want, and I want it when I'm ready, but I need to make that expression now. So we really need to organize. I spoke at a conference in New Zealand a couple weeks ago, and I should have brought the conference, the quote from this keynote speaker the day before was that the natural burial lobby, has it all wrong, and it's basically a fringe market and it's too expensive. And there's a lot of evidence that a growing segment of the population, and recent studies suggest perhaps as large as 60% in the U.S. right now, wants an eco-friendly way out. So we need to continue to dispel the myth that this is something that people don't want, and we need to let our wishes be known. And as Katrina said, whether it means planning, we need to let our family members know, we need to let our friends know, our loved ones, this is what we want. We need to talk about it. We need to destigmatize some of these issues around death and disposition, and I think push the conversation into the mainstream.
What, with that in mind, what do you think is the biggest obstacle that new or existing green burial spaces need to navigate, and including things like the Urban Death Project? What are the biggest obstacles here?
Well, it's funny because go ahead.
Go ahead.
Katrina, you're first.
Okay, I've had a number of people say, and this is such a funny thing because it's what Joe brought up about the fringe is a great point. People will say to me, I want to be composted, I want to turn into soil, or I want a natural burial, but I can't. But the hardest thing you're going to do is convince others. And I've had so many people say that to me, and the fact is, there are many, many people for whom this natural burial, natural decomposition just makes sense. And so I don't think that, even though people often say that the hardest thing will be the cultural conversion, I don't think that's the case, actually, because I think there are so many of us who do want these options. So, God, that doesn't answer the question at all, though, about what I suppose it would be. Some of the legal and regulatory hurdles aren't impossible to overcome, but just in terms of the amount of time those things can take, that can be one of the biggest challenges we're facing, for example.
So, for example, in Seattle right now, what were the challenges? I mean, sorry, do you plan on having the first Urban Death Project in Seattle?
That's the goal. If Chicago called up and said they wanted the first one there and offered a spot, I'd say sure. But Seattle is a great city for this, and there's a lot of interest and support here for it to happen. So, but yeah, right now in Washington State, you can be cremated, you can be buried, or you can donate your body to science. So it's not yet legal to compost somebody here.
So what are you doing now to try to change that in order for this project to come to fruition?
So I'm actually working with Tanya Marsh, among others, and in addition, funeral death care providers and funeral directors here in the state to open up the definition of what's available, because I think there's more interest beyond the Urban Death Project in having more options than just cremation and burial. So, it's about talking to legislators and starting to put together a bill that would broaden the definition of what's allowed. And we're probably another year out from actually putting together something formal, legally speaking, but Tanya's a big part of that.
Great. Okay, so I guess it's on a state level then in the United States.
It is on a state level, yeah.
Okay.
And sorry, Joe, what are some of the biggest obstacles with what you're dealing with?
In the United States and Australia?
I think in North America, it's really getting financing. Projects have been slow to come online because, it's still perceived by some as I said, as a fringe market rather than an emerging market. And so we've had a lot of bootstrap projects, but it's been difficult, I think, for some operators to get the right kind of financing together in a country like Australia or New Zealand, where there's governmental regulation that really doesn't exist in North America. It's really getting these governmental bodies to get behind this idea and to be convinced that there in fact is a market, that they need to set aside space or create new facilities to meet this demand. Those are both part of the same problem. I think they'll take care of themselves. I think as things progress as they are, we're going to see that happen, but no one knows if it's a few years or several years out. I hope it's sooner rather than later.
Okay, great.
This next question that we have, we actually received a few questions from an old friend of Keeper's, Lauren Leroy. She's actually a funeral director who blogs at littlemissfuneral.com. She was also our first guest on Talk Death with Caitlin Doty. And so Lauren asks, and I think this is really for Joe here, as someone who lives in a community that is currently not embracing green burial practices, what would I need to do if I myself wanted a green burial? How could one request a green burial in a traditional burial cemetery or setting?
Well, there are a couple of options if nothing exists. One is to explore, if you have enough acreage in many parts of North America, usually 2.5 to 5 acres, you can actually be buried on your own property. And this is whole body burial. If we're talking cremation, scattering, or burial, typically it's fairly easy to do, but a whole body green burial would require going through a county, typically, or a local municipality to explore what permitting is required. Usually a plat is required. There's a new trend, or I hope it's going to be a trend, where people can actually purchase land if they don't live in a rural area adjacent to a park, and then make arrangements with the park agency to gift it back. So have been working on a model project in Texas with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation, where we identify parcels on the outskirts to create buffer zones, and then that land is given back, so there's some tax deductibility that benefits the person or family. But the other thing they can do is approach an existing cemetery operator about, working to find a new option to organize a bit. That's happened in a couple of instances. The Green Burial Council is getting ready to develop chapters, so there can be local affiliates on the ground getting this conversation going and talking with potential operators and potential existing cemeteries who may want to partner up with conservation entities in the community. It's really getting that conversation going locally, and there's a growing number of groups, whether they're memorial societies or senior organizations or religious groups, that are willing to be part of that conversation. That's what I think is most important right now.
Are funeral directors, traditional funeral directors, do they tend to be open to these kinds of ideas?
Well, that's a good question, because it's really hard to describe this industry with a broad stroke. I've been around it for now almost 17 years, and every time I think I understand it, I realize that I don't. It's very fragmented. So there are some people in this field that love this idea, just like they did with cremation, But there are many people who are still frightened by cremation, funeral directors who will do everything they can to convince a family it's not a good option. It depends who you're really talking to. I think most funeral directors in North America realize today that this is coming and that they're not going to get in the way of it, like some tried to do with cremation. And the best thing that they can do is make sure, it's on their menu. They're receptive to serving families who want to have this offering, and that they don't argue. But it's there's still some old stalwarts out there, hard to believe, but they exist probably in every field.
Katrina, what type of reactions have you received from the death profession right now, from funeral directors, from cemeterians? Have you spoken to anybody?
Oh yeah, I would say it's mixed, really. There's a tremendous community of people doing alternative death care work, and that could be anyone from someone putting together a green cemetery or green burial grounds to to celebrants and death midwives helping people have home funerals, to even a sort of typical funeral director who's trying to broaden their menu of choices. So I think there's some amazing people. I know that there's some amazing people that are doing this work. A lot of them happen to live in Seattle, the premier death care city. I'm just branding it like that right now. But I'm sure there's plenty of sort of conventional funeral directors out there who just think what I'm doing is just so ridiculous and wacky that they don't even bother really getting in touch, honestly. But I know that the community of alternative death care professionals is very strong and doing work in a really collaborative way. And it's been amazing to sort of see the connections people will make with each other, and I've been connected to so many incredible people that way, because we really know it's whether it's green burial or you know, a biodegradable urn or human composting, it's all the same movement, actually, which is to give consumers more choices.
Great.
And Katrina, I was really shocked but delighted to see one of the leading trade association spokespeople, in a major publication sort of endorse the project. I couldn't imagine that happening, 5 or 10 years ago. But I think and it speaks to your, what you're about as a person, but I think you probably have more receptivity than you may even know within the field, because I continue to hear really positive things.
Awesome. Well, who are you talking about there? Just curious.
The New York Times did this with the NFPA a few years ago, or it might have been last year, actually. I can't remember who the spokesperson was, but they go to the large trade associations for comments, and we were in the point 10 years ago. Green Burial, they would talk to the Green Burial Council, and then they'd go back to the industry as if they were in opposition, and the trade association have something to say about the fact that no one wants this, and kind of an eye roll, but that wasn't happening, which is big.
Yeah, well, I think it's been pretty amazing, and I realized that it really is, like you said, it's the moment. If I'd tried to do this 5, 7, 10 years ago, it would have fallen flat. But there's this huge death positivity movement. We're seeing death and alternative death care options in the news all the time, and it's the environmental movement is moving forward, and then we've got the whole baby boomers aging thing, and it's like a perfect historical moment for this to actually take off. And I recognize that it's kind of dumb luck on my part that that's happening, but it's great because it actually has a chance where it wouldn't have 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's been really exciting. We were actually just at the ICCFA, which is a trade show essentially for International Cremation and Cemetery of America, essentially. And it was really interesting. We were actually neighbors with Koyo, who are doing the mushroom burial suit, and there was really great reaction. Some people were really walking by and they're like, what is this? Trying to feel it, trying to understand it, and then everyone else was like, wow, this is it, this is amazing. And there was a really nice reaction. So I think it's definitely infiltrating the industry, and we're especially just someone who receives the publications, the trade publications all the time. You're always seeing at least one article on green, which is great, and it's really inspirational.
And this is maybe a bit anecdotal, but I lectured a death and dying course last year, and I did a survey of the 100 or so students that were there, and the vast majority, when asked how they want their body to be taken care of after they die, the vast majority wrote something about a green burial. A few wrote about the Urban Death Project.
Yeah,
cool. I think it's even in the public sphere. It's getting there.
Yeah. So let's actually move on to the next question. I love that topic, but we should probably. This is still very much related. It really speaks to the ritual, secular or non, aspects of funerary and burial practices. So this one is by Morbid Curiosity Game again. Thank you for your great questions. She would love to know how those grieving respond differently or not to attending green burials, green funerals. So maybe, Katrina, do you want to start by letting us know your thoughts on this?
Well, it might be more of an answer for Joe, but the truth is, I know there's something to the role of nature in our grieving process, and I have not really been able to articulate it well. I can't put my finger on it. I began doing this design work a few years ago, in part because I thought how interesting it was that so many people, even if they live in cities and love their cities, when they die are brought outside of the city. Either after being cremated, you're brought to some beautiful mountaintop or the ocean to be spread, or if you're brought to a natural burial ground, or you're buried in a bucolic garden cemetery somewhere. There was something about that connection to nature that seems really important. Not just for the grieving, but for when we're dying, and for knowing that will be where we return to. And so part of the work with the Urban Death Project is trying to bring that nature and that connection to the natural cycles into the cities. Because Well, first of all, wouldn't it be wonderful if we do love our cities, if we could stay in them after we've died? But also, having a deeper connection to nature is really important for those of us living in urban centers. So I guess that's just to say I can't articulate it well, but I do believe there's a deep and important role of nature in grieving.
Joe, do you have any thoughts?
I do, and I always think of that poem that John Muir wrote that I'll butcher about, let the children walk in nature and they'll see the beautiful communions and blendings of death and life in our, mountains and streams and hills and meadows, and they'll see that death is as beautiful as life and stingless indeed. I think if you ask me in a nutshell what really draws people to the concept that we're talking about today, it's allowing death to connect to life and seeing those things as entwined. And I think that what really bodes well for these green burial grounds is that they allow people to experience that and to enjoy a continuing bond with their dead, which our culture has not really been big on. But what's emerging as we move out of this Freudian model about grief being something you get over, right? You lose someone you love, you have a hole in your heart forever. And sometimes the best thing you can do is to remember that connection with that person that you really cared about. And so going back to a burial ground or some place that reminds you of that connection can be really cathartic. The problem has been, people have not wanted to go back, including myself, to conventional cemeteries. They're oppressive and odd oftentimes, and they're not inviting. But taking a walk in the woods and remembering where an end-of-life ritual took place and a person is buried can really be beautiful. And this is emerging as a leading theory among psychologists today for bereavement. And I just think that nature does provide a way for us to connect death to life. Very powerful way, and I think that's really at the core of what's behind this movement in many ways.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because even in the actual process, so I know, Katrina, I read on your site about the process that the family goes through when they bring the family in and then they place like the wood pellets or on top of the body, and even Joe with green burial, oftentimes family members are bringing, let's say, a wicker casket, or they're moving the body within a shroud, being very close to the body and to the actual physical body, which you don't see a lot when you have this massive, Cadillac of a casket, right? It's a totally different concept and connection. So even when we're talking about, so Katrina, maybe why would you want the families to be involved, like so deeply involved in that process? What was the thought process around that?
That's always been part of the idea, in part because natural burial in the countryside, with all the connection it brings for families and friends, has always been an inspiration for the Urban Death Project. And again, it's how do you have that same connection to nature and the process in cities? And so from there, and working in an urban context, the design became vertically based. So there's a vertical core, and then always it became the friends and family that would use their living energy to bring the dead up around ramps to the top of that core, and then laying the deceased into wood chips, covering them up, and thus starting that transformation of the body of your loved one from human to soil. I think is very powerful. And so I guess it just always was the obvious thing to make it a part of the experience for those people, and it's never been hands off. Yeah, I think that I get excited when I think about this conceptual journey that the dead get to take through the core as they are literally transformed and cease to be human. And there's something very powerful and beautiful of that for the remaining friends and family to think that way. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and Joe, on the same level, it's, I had the privilege of attending a Green Burial Council meeting when I was at the last convention, and what kept on being repeated was, if people would only just attend, once you attend that one green burial and you have that one moment, it's like you can't look back on the traditional way.
Conventional.
Conventional. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Conventional.
Katrina, this is a question for you as well. It's a practical question. It comes from Twitter, from user Nicola Perrin. She wants to know, is there a way to positively track which compost is mom or dad?
I would say that is the #1 question. It's a really good one. The short answer is no, not really. And that's been a conscious design decision along the way. You know, our American ways of death and death care are so individualistic and so focused on one person, one grave plot, one urn filled with ashes from that one person, and we're really trying to look at a collective process. That said, the individual has their own ceremony. The memorial service, which includes the laying in of the body into wood chips, is very much individual, and the process doesn't mix bodies together. They're very much they go through their own. They go through the system on their own, separated by about 3 to 4 feet of co-composting materials, and then the closest I can say is that when the process is over, you can take home some soil created from your loved one and your loved one's neighbor. Now, again, that's on purpose, and it's because, and I think that we're ready for a shift. I truly do think this can go along with our death positivity shift, in that we are all part of nature when we're alive, and when we die, we're even more so. And so. That coupled with the fact that, and I get all kind of geeked out in my non-scientific way, but during this process of natural decomposition, our molecules are rearranged, and we literally cease to be human during this process, and we've transformed into something else. So that to give back only the compost created from one person would be only purely symbolic, if that makes sense. So yeah.
I know in a lot of the research I've done in death studies, the idea of pilgrimage is really important. People always want to return to a site to memorialize the dead. Have you built that into your project in any way?
Yeah, so a facility, say an urban death project facility, and by the way, we're starting to call it recomposition, is the new word we're using for that process and that system, as in to recompose us. So it's made up of the building that houses the core, which is where we are naturally decomposed, and it also is made up of gardens and grounds. And these will look very different depending on the facility in which city it exists in, but absolutely every one of these places will have gardens that are nourished from the compost created there. So it would be a place of memorial for the city and for the neighborhood.
Joe, same question. How are people able to memorialize the dead in a green burial setting?
Well, some people choose to use the landscape as their memorial and have nothing. And it's interesting. I was doing some work with a focus group where this question came up a few weeks ago, and some people were saying how the idea of impermanence was really appealing to them. And for other people, it's not. So some people may want a marker that is intentionally going to degrade over 10, 20 years. Some people want to know that there's a rock that they can come back to and know that spot. It's very, very, very individualistic. I think what Katrina is saying is so true. Our customs have been pretty prescribed over the last century. And we've just sort of gone along with things out of a sense of decorum. But now, the lid's been lifted and we can really think about what makes sense to us. It's a function sometimes of whether or not people have heirs or about their religious beliefs. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that people choose or don't choose to memorialize. But I think, some people don't want to come back to a spot. There are people who are being interred in green burial grounds whose who are having no ceremonies, just a sort of a direct disposition, and that's okay. All bets are off, and what has been really cool, I think, is when the green burial operators are accommodating families in ways that have never been accommodated, and funeral directors have backed away as well, and they're just watching, and we're seeing people, you know, reinvent ritual and get involved in ways that are meaningful to them, and because there are no rules in this context, right? So some really cool things are going on, and we're going to continue to see, I think, a lot more of them.
Great. Well, Joe, on that subject, we have actually a question from our blog from Joseph, and maybe not on that subject, but a little more negative. His question is there any part of the green burial movement that you think is just a fad or really isn't feasible?
Well, yes.
Human composting.
No, this is a delicate one, but I think today, you know, if you said the one thing I've been probably the most disappointed is that we haven't been able to facilitate landscape level conservation. So, and I have a colleague and mentor, Billy Campbell, who started the first green burial ground. He's been trumpeting, let's save 1 million acres with this concept, which we can do, but at current rates of traction, it's going to take about 10,000 years. Because there's something that's problematic with the model. Once you open a 32-acre burial ground, you're going to put as many bodies in there as you can before you can take down additional acreage. So there has to be a way to tie in memorial gifts, additional donations, and have a mechanism in place to really almost fundraise to do conservation if that's the goal. But saying that, I've sort of backed away from that idea. Do we need to save all those acres for this to be an important movement? It's certainly furthering legitimate environmental aims. It's reducing carbon emissions. It's protecting worker health. It's conserving natural resources, preserving, restoring habitat. I just don't know if we're going to see the large, tracts of land or large acres. That said, too, I'm also very involved with conservation organizations around the globe now, trying to make it easier for them to get involved with this idea and to allow this to become more of a vehicle for really environmental legacy. But it's a niche. It's not a big part of the movement, but I think for a lot of people it is important, and it provides a lot of solace. And so I'm trying to work in that space right now. But I think it's a misnomer to just say that this is a vehicle for real large-scale land conservation today.
Okay, that's interesting. Katrina, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm glad to hear that, actually, because I think sometimes when I'm talking about natural burial, I do talk about the conservation potential. So it's just good to have a little bit of framing around that, yeah.
Okay. So our next question, I think, so this comes from our blog, and it's also from Nicola Perrin. And she's interested in ways that we can think about conservation within the traditional landscape, if you will. So, she's asking, why are we not looking at greener ways to cremate by fire? If we're going to cremate by fire, are there ways that we can make it a greener process? Is anyone in North America trying to develop these? If either of you know, yeah, that's really her question.
Do you want me to take it, Katrina? I think we both probably have some thoughts on this. There are a couple of new modes out there. One I think still in research phase, Promessa, using liquid nitrogen and sound waves. There's also aquamation that exists, water based cremation that renders. It reminded me of the Urban Death Project at first, because I had a conversation with people that wanted to use the remains, which are compostable somehow, rather than having them go into the sewage system as they now do. That's problematic for different reasons. But here's the thing to remember about cremation. We hired an environmental planning firm a number of years ago because we wanted to develop an offset program at the Green Burial Council. And the scientist that was working with us got back to us and said, we can do this, but it's hard to tell what retort they burn more or less efficiently depending on a number of factors, how often they're used. But the person said if we look at the average cremation, it's probably about a $5 offset to a carbon ton, which may mean something to someone, but it's not significant compared to what we're doing, heating and cooling our homes, driving our cars around. But it's perhaps what you do afterwards. So there's opportunities to use that scattering or burial at a cemetery that's facilitating conservation or restoration. There's some undersea reefs, some, not all, that actually are designed to create marine habitat. You don't like that idea. There are projects that probably can take cremated remains and do environmentally beneficial things that we'll see coming online. But I don't know of anything besides those two projects. Katrina, you're probably closer to this and have better insights than me.
No, I don't think so. But I think the two you mentioned, resumation or alkaline hydrolysis and promesa, are like not fire-based. So, but those are interesting options as well, I think. And then there's certainly a fair amount of projects that are happening around more, biodegradable urns or urns that can grow a tree. And I think all those things are really useful in terms of getting the conversation going. And I agree with you, Joe, that the amount of pollution caused by cremation is, to be perfectly honest, like I drive a car around, it's probably negligible in the long run. Mm-hmm. And but for me, in some ways, it's more about the fact that when we're incinerated, the potential that's left in our bodies, the nutrient potential, and again, it might not be that much by the time we die, when we're all old and small, but it's destroyed by the cremation process. And so I think for me, it's like, why wouldn't we want to give back what nutrients remain in our bodies if we can? It might, back to the earth that sustained us all our living lives. So even things like a biodegradable urn are still burying inert material that's actually really doesn't have nutrients in it anymore. So while I like those ideas because they kind of get at the environmental toll and they also are about nature and our connection to nature, I think that my preference is to have our bodies feed nature back.
That's really interesting. So, if some people are wondering, oh, should I go into the ocean and I become a reef, or should I be planted in a biodegradable urn? It doesn't actually make that much of a difference. That's really important. I mean, it might, but you know what I mean.
It does in the case of undersea reefs. Just because if you push a shopping cart in the water, you're creating marine habitat. Some of the reefs aren't engineered properly to withstand Category 4 storms, and there's issues around that. They may not be made of material that really function to create habitat. So there's things that some trust provider out there should be looking at. That's where we need to go with this. There's a lot of great ideas, but there's some stinkers out there too. And it's very difficult for the consumer to move past skepticism toward ideas that really are furthering legitimate environmental aims. That's one of the big goals of the Green Bureau Council, to be on the front line, helping the public know where to go because, the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. anyway is telling us that 60 or 70% of environmental claims are empty or misleading, but they're not giving us any help, moving past that skepticism, suggesting that we have. That's what we have to figure out how to do, and it's a challenging task.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's also, moving past these ideals that people build up, like being turned into a tree is something that we hear all the time, but, is it working? What's the feasibility? Is that tree going to be able to adapt into that environment? So there's a lot of other questions that come up that aren't necessarily being answered in the marketing material provided to the end user, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
With that skepticism in mind, have either of you come across any misinformation when people are talking to you about your own projects?
Sure. Yeah. I've had people say, one of the issues with using the word compost is that people think of their home kitchen composting, and the truth is that livestock mortality composting, which is what the project is based on, is a little bit different than that. But I've had people say, oh, by the way, you can't compost a whole body. You have to chop it up first. And I'm thinking, well, I promise you I wouldn't try to do this if it wasn't feasible. So I've definitely had like a lot of just sort of like knee-jerk reactions with people just saying you just can't simply be done. And I'm far enough from an engineer and a scientist that I would never try to do something like this if I didn't know that it could be done quite feasible. So.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of greenwashing going on in every field, and this one is certainly not immune to it. But my big top pet peeves, I'd say, are with cemeteries. You have cemeteries that are, to give you an example, down here I saw one that was charging twice as much for green burial ground to preserve koala habitat.
Oh.
But if it wasn't, it was a small municipal cemetery, and I said, what's going to happen? Because they weren't getting good traction. They said, oh, we'll just, mow it down and turn it back into the cemetery. I thought, what about those families that had been promised that was part of their environmental legacy? So we need to have restrictions, and we need to uphold promises. There's a lot of, very complicated, but figuring out, what makes a casket green or natural or environmentally friendly or suitable for this purpose can be challenging. But to start with, I think we need to make sure that we don't have toxic chemicals that are being used, and we make sure that we let the public know that they can choose a product from materials of construction that are truly sustainable or reclaimed, and that and perhaps locally harvested and produced. And when it comes to body preservation, there's still a lot of misinformation about embalming, and there's unnecessary toxic chemicals being used. They're still touted as green because you have to remember, anyone can make any promise about something being natural, green, organic without providing any proof. Mm-hmm. They don't have to provide a material saying data sheet that's been analyzed or anything else, and that's where we need to step up. I just don't see how things are going to change otherwise. There's a lot of pressure to again, in this context, grieving families oftentimes have limited bandwidth, which is why, this has been, there's all these challenging consumer issues, but I think we need to do an even better job getting forward good information, more verifiable standards, and people willing to say, all right, I'm going to provide this information if I'm going to make a claim. That to me seems like a starting point. I don't know why we allow people in this day and age to make environmental claims that are unjustified.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Even today, we had a conversation with a colleague who was reading something, and he was like, oh, so what's the difference between natural and organic? And something as simple as these two words that we hear all the time are not even properly defined. So there's not a lot of trust built into that. So I absolutely understand that.
Well, and with that in mind, I'll ask this question to both of you. Joe, what do you see the future being like? What's the ideal future for the Green Burial Council, for green burial in general?
Well, the Green Burial Council is enjoying a growth spurt, and I can take no credit for it because I'm no longer formally involved, and I work in an advisory capacity with the organization only. But I think they're seeing that the demand is really starting to pop up, and people are really talking to providers enough to where there's some excitement, and they're gearing up for the next phase of their organizational growth. I think there's going to be more pressure put on organizations like the Green Burial Council and other independent trust providers. And to me, this is my big concern. Governmental bodies don't want to do this work. It's not revenue neutral. And so we leave it to these small nonprofits, but look how fragile the democracy is in the United States right now. I mean, what hope is there for a small independent nonprofit that has to do its own fundraising, and in this case, has pressures put on it by providers in the industry and all sorts of stakeholders. So we need to be able to do this work credibly, and I think it takes more resources than we currently have. Otherwise, it's just, we're going to be really limited, and I think we do need to find foundations, funders stepping forward. I think governmental bodies are going to have to assist. If we're going to have this green economy emerge, if we're really going to do something about climate change, we need to know whether these products and services and facilities are really legit or not, and if they're really making a difference. And there should be a better way for the public to be able to make those choices. And it's a very confusing marketplace, and it's been made in some ways more confusing by the internet, right? So I think that's my hope, is that we figure ways of making it easier and having more information flow out there that can be understood, so that people are really, as I said, incentivized and are able to move past the skepticism that we see now exists.
Great. Katrina, what's the ideal future for the Urban Death Project and for the projects you're interested in?
Well, more broadly for the alternative death care movement, I think the future is a real menu of choices for people, and a transparency, building on what Joe was just saying about really understanding the environmental impact of what we are choosing, but also understanding the prices, understanding the system and the processes behind what we're doing. I think the exciting thing for me is building an organization that's really based on transparency, and sometimes that makes people squeamish because I'm talking about bodies decomposing, but in the end it's about embracing that decomposition and embracing for sure the transparency, and really just trying to build something that we haven't had yet in terms of the funeral industry. So I'm really excited about it from that point of view, and I think I think this conversation will be completely different in 10 years and just wildly future driven and different in 20 years. I think we will look back on this as a real turning point.
So everyone, please schedule in your calendars 10 years from now so we can have this conversation. So we're just about finishing up, so we wanted to give you both the opportunity to let everyone know what your next projects are, how they can keep in touch with you, how they can receive updates. So Joe, can you let us know what's coming next and how we can all stay in touch?
Sure. Well, I recently launched a small project that I hope grows at conservationburial.com, which is letting families know that they have the opportunity to actually help expand state and national parks with disposition, whole body and cremation. And we're just in the process. We've been talking with different park service agencies and other conservation entities around, mostly in Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. and Canada to start. But I think that that's going to be a new option that I hope moves into the mainstream. The other thing I'm interested in that doesn't have as much to do with the environmental work, but is just trying to help people in this field and their life space in general improve their psycho-socio-spiritual competencies. I think that we have people on the front lines with families that aren't being trained or supported, and I think when you're around death and dying and grieving folks a lot, I think it takes a toll. I've seen that. So I've been working on a new sort of a fellowship initiative with some folks involved in palliative care and hospice and cemetery funeral work. And I'm hoping that comes about as well as within the next year or two. And I can be reached at conservationburial.com info or Joe Sehee and Gmail or gmail.com as well. Happy to always talk to anyone that has an idea or wants to has a question. Love doing that.
Great. You should definitely talk to the death midwives around North America about that last project you just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I know they're so primed to be doing that work. They are doing that work. The problem right now is that it's hard for people again to discern who's able to do that, because there aren't standards, there's not training yet, but we're going to see that happen, and absolutely they're involved in that conversation. There's some really cool work going on in that field. It's really very encouraging.
Yeah.
Thank you again for having me today.
It's been an
Thank you.
absolute pleasure.
So Katrina, do you want to tell us about, I know everyone knows that you're working on this project. Do you want to tell us the next phases and how we can help out or hear more?
Yeah, if you want to be updated, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm at Katrina Spade on Instagram now. Yeah, and if you want to help, if you want to join in and get a newsletter once a month, I'm just about to send one out that's going to have information on our prototype program, which we're working on right now. I'm so thrilled about it. It's a really exciting next step. You can sign up for the newsletter at www.urbandeathproject.org. You can also make a donation if you're moved to do so. And yeah, that's the best way to connect. Social media is good, but the newsletter, I go into a little more depth for our newsletter friends because it's just a good way of reaching people who I know are interested in watching this unfold and helping make it happen.
Great. So on our end, we also have a newsletter. So if everyone is interested in watching the next Talkdeath, do go to keeper.com/blog and sign up for our newsletter, and you'll receive updates on when the next Talkdeath is going to be, and we'll be making a really great announcement soon. Obviously follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and of course download our mobile app. I'm going to just keep plugging that, and I guess that's about it for this edition. This was really a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you both for taking the time to speak to everyone. This was really fascinating.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be
Thank you for having us.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll be doing a follow-up. Please share this with everyone. We'll be making some shorter videos as well for those of you who don't feel like watching a full hour long. We understand. So thank you again. Yep. And that's all for Talkdeath Edition 4.
Awesome.